Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second part of the MoLab conversation on the topic about the travel restrictions. And as we just discussed a moment ago about the complexity of internal mobility restrictions. And that really leads to a question that I have been thinking over last weeks, especially when the crisis in India became worse since April. That is a question, what really immobility means. Immobility certainly does not simply mean that people stop moving. Immobility on large scale, if you have large scale immobility, actually it means reorganization of mobility. If you look at the Wuhan in China in February and March until April, actually 2020, the very strict and now we appear to be effective lockdown was sustained by very carefully organized mobility. Mobility of drivers, of medical staff, and of a large number of civil servants who deliver food to each doorsteps and who visit household to record the temperature and etc. So this, I think a very important question to be discussed probably in coming years is a question about the capabilities or the capacities of stopping mobilities in the time of crisis. We have talked about the importance of mobilities, since the 1990s. We know how important mobility is, but we probably forgot. Any society, in order to be resilient, you should develop the capacity to stop mobility in a very, of course, exceptional circumstances. So now I wanted to ask you, what's your observation about this? What constitutes this type of capability of stopping mobilities? First of all, let's talk about the impacts of mobility restrictions on different groups of populations. I know, I think Lorenzo has written about how vulnerable populations often suffer a great deal from the mobility restrictions. And so we know that lots of people actually live on what we call the mobile livelihoods. And once the movement stopped and simply they lose the basic source of income and the basic source of daily necessities. So can anyone comment on that?
I can go first and then I'll let the others try to complement with something maybe more pertinent also because Biao, you are really the global expert on this topic, and I feel anything I will say won't sound particularly new, but two observations. The first is in a society where immobility becomes very important, then there is a need of developing very sophisticated logistical systems to make that immobility sustainable. And what the pandemic shows is that complete immobility is impossible. It's always about striking a balance between the right amount of mobility and the right amount of immobility. Where, of course, the idea of right is contested. There is no right and wrong. But I want to give you a very concrete example of this. When Switzerland decided to close down the borders, there was a huge problem for those Swiss cities on the border because most of the medical personnel working in the hospitals comes from the other countries on the other side of the border, Italy and France. In Geneva, 70% of the medical personnel is French. So, of course, you can try to immobilize some people, but at the same time, you have to make sure that other travelers can continue to move and serve the others. Now, of course, the example of Geneva is rather uncontroversial. We can all agree that medical personnel in that case is an essential category of workers and travelers. But then there are other categories of people where the concept of essentiality can become much more politicized and controversial. And we can think of examples, but I'll stop it here also because you said you want to raise questions, so I will let the audience reflect on what those categories may be.
So if I can just add on to Lorenzo's excellent explanation and do some promotion of the Global Sit Observatory, on Monday, we will start a new forum debate related to ensuring mobility rights for vulnerable populations. And the kickoff has been written by me and Rainer Baubach, and we look, amongst other things, at how COVID has affected some categories of vulnerable populations. If you think about the construction workers from India in the Gulf countries who, as a result of the inability to move internally, have been either deported or put in very precarious positions, or also the environmental people fleeing, in a way, environmental disasters who, as a result of pandemic, whose lives have become endangered. So I think that immobility, in a way, as much as it's impossible to fully achieve it, I think it can have a very adverse consequences on the most vulnerable kind of groups of people, and that we need to think of ways in which this mobility, the essential mobility, and again, we can talk about what is essential, where, and for whom, but some categories of mobility, I would argue, would need to be retained always.
If I may add just a very quick kind of spoiler response to the question that Lorenzo posed at the end of his response, just from the data that we gathered on the exceptions, it's very striking that most countries in the world made exceptions for their own citizens and often also for non-citizen residents. And then at the other kind of end of the spectrum, very few exceptions were made for students and for tourists, and tourists are perhaps not so surprising, but those seeking asylum are then also in this category of those for whom exceptions were very rarely made. And I guess those are the people who, whereas you can understand why you want to limit travel for tourism, those are the perhaps most obviously vulnerable people who are really severely affected by the restrictions imposed, which I guess goes then to the kind of political issues that Lorenzo was, I think, alluding to. But I want to speak on his behalf, of course.
Great. I mean, I love the idea, ensuring the right to move. When mobility is a necessity for some people, while the mobility is not a right, mobility as a necessity but forbidden, then naturally it leads to smuggling, lead to clandestine mobilities. And the early academic research suggested, travel restriction does not work very well, because whenever you impose mobility restrictions, there will be secret clandestine mobilities which evade effective testing, monitoring, and also treatment, medical treatment, right? So I wonder whether or not in your research you come across any kind of systematic evidence that shows there is certain relation between mobility control and the increase of clandestine mobilities in certain circumstances.
I think this is the point where we have to be honest and say we actually don't have data on that, because we don't know. We can intuitively imagine that this is the case, but we are only looking at official sources and restrictions, not so much at the consequences of restrictions. What I can say, however, is that we notice, and here I say we as academics in general and people who have been following the pandemic, not only our group of researchers, a strong connection between a certain kind of threat, the pandemic threats, and the idea of a certain type of migrant. So mobilities that become associated with the idea of risk, which was not necessarily the case before. Mobility in some cases was considered a form of capital even. And of course, the creation or the framing of mobility as a risk for society can have very negative consequences. This will not be the first time. If we think about migration, and none of us is actually a migration scholar, I think. Yale team and myself come more from the field of citizenship studies, but we know that in migration studies, many people have been studying the securitization of migrants and associated securitization to terrorism and crime. And now what we see is that migrants are associated to yet another kind of threat or danger, that is the spread of the virus, which empirically is absolutely not proven, of course. But it would not be surprising to see that this results in stricter controls at the borders, additional sanitary filters, and as you were saying, Biao, this in turn would lead to ways to get around those controls. But honestly, we don't have the data, so this is pure speculation on my side, I'm afraid.
Yeah, just to add on to that, and we haven't actually explored this issue, but if you think about most of the prohibitions that have happened throughout the course of human history, and most of them have resulted in an amplification of illicit and clandestine activities. And unfortunately, the patterns of human migration were not let's say, free from this, in a way, informal market for human smuggling, etc., etc. So I guess that, in a way, pandemic has had an effect on that. But I think future research is needed on this topic, and perhaps also a research of a different kind than the one that we have done in this project.
Tim, do you have anything to add? Yeah.
So very quickly, yeah, this moves slightly away from the question, so apologies in advance for that. But it strikes me that there's also a link where the very fact of having immigration control creates the possibility of irregular migration, as you're pointing out, and then that migration detention is then, a kind of consequence of that, where people states try and sort of impose those controls, and for those people who end up in migration detention, then clearly that's an undesirable outcome at any time, but particularly during a pandemic, that's particularly has particularly severe sort of health consequences for them. And I think there's a sort of interesting variation as well in whether states are choosing to include undocumented migrants within their vaccination schemes, for instance, or how far they're able to access healthcare, and the spread of the virus within those centres and so on is another kind of issue, which is not something I know anything about, but I'm aware of as being an interesting issue, and one where more research is probably valuable.
Yeah, so that's great. I think we all agree that one-way control, just by prohibiting people from moving when to work, in order for people to stay, you have to provide certain services that enable them to live their normal life without moving around. So if the government asks you for advice, what is the single most important thing they should do if they want to lock down a place effectively, what would be your suggestion according to your research? Is it about trust, communication, or is it about basic material delivery system? Or what? I mean, did you see anything from the experiences so far?
You're asking us very difficult questions, you know that. So I guess that we probably all will have some pieces of advice, but one would be to take into account basic human rights and also the human needs of different groups and different populations, and try to avoid immediate adverse consequences on different groups. The second one is study different policy options, because sometimes an obvious measure actually is far less effective than something that would be studied and developed. And I think that by this time, we are so far in the pandemic that we now actually do have quite a lot of data that can help policymakers to make more informed and more effective policy choices. And with this, I hand over to Lorenzo and Tim.
My recommendation would be connected to something that Tim mentioned in the previous clip. So initially, at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw national responses to the pandemic. I think we can all agree that transnational cooperation is necessary. But we also saw at work in many countries was at least an attempt to take decisions together with the subnational units of governments, cities and regions, and where that collaboration was effective, then the reach of certain restrictions was more contained, or more limited. And I think that's very important. In Italy, I'm not sure it made sense to do a national lockdown at the very beginning of the pandemic when the virus was mainly spreading in 2 regions in the north. So that's just to say that a crucial component of this is, of course, cooperation across the board, but not only across different national governments, but also within countries, between central governments and subnational units, so that answers can be tailored.
Yeah, just a quick thought from me that this relates to the exceptions and the points that Lorenzo made in relation to what we consider to be essential travel across borders, and where, as Lorenzo said, medical professionals crossing borders, that's understandable, particularly during a pandemic. It seems to me that some of the exceptions that have been granted have been driven by conceiving of certain categories of people as being economically productive, and that's the justification for allowing them to cross borders, where those who are fleeing for their lives, for their safety, seeking refuge somewhere, or are mobile in an attempt to meet their basic human needs, have been perhaps less catered for. And so perhaps reassessing the kind of justificatory basis for the regimes of exceptions would be advisable from my perspective.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think there is an interesting distinction. A distinction can be made between what the team said, the regime of exception, vis-a-vis the method or measure of differentiation. What do we see now? As your research indicated, actually exception is a very important thing during this time. Because you say lockdown, no one is allowed to move, but it is not practical. So therefore, every country comes with a list of exception. But this is predicated on the notion that the whole country, society is like a flat piece of pancake. So everyone stop moving, but I let this corner pancake to move around to serve the services of the rest of pancake. But as we just discussed now, the society is not a flat pancake. The different group of population have very different needs and also have different capacities, right? I mean, if you look at Pakistan now, and people say, in Europe, people often worried about the supermarket become empty, people just start buying up goods from the supermarket. But the situation in developing countries are often the opposite. People do not have enough cash to buy food that is enough to last 2 or 3 days. It's just simply impossible for them to stay put. They have to go out to earn money, etc. So it is very differentiated. So how we can move from this kind of blanket policy plus exception to a more nuanced differentiation to start with, I think that will be a major policy challenge. And to be honest, when I read the debate in WHO among the policy makers, I'm afraid that the dominant perception is still treating the whole society as quite homogeneous, the human versus the virus, But forget, the human and the human are very different, and the virus mean very different things for different humans. How to accommodate that will remain a challenge. Yeah, that's a wonderful discussion.